This book, a question that would not let go. How is it that the same weapon, a device capable of flash, can be treated?
Welcome to Cockpit Reads by Dexter Dow. The book that's going to be read today is Atomic Privilege. And we're going to be flying from New Hampshire to upstate New York and a few other places that I have lived. Enjoy the flight.
As the indispensable foundation of one nation's security, began with a question that would not let go. How is it that the same weapon, a device capable of incinerating a city in a single flash, as the indispensable foundation of one nation's security, and as an intolerable threat to international peace when another nation pursues it? The question is not rhetorical. It has driven invasions, shaped sanctions regimes, justified assassinations, collapsed diplomatic agreements, and restructured the sovereignty of entire states. Yet the framework that produces these outcomes is rarely examined as a system. We debate whether Iran should enrich uranium. We debate whether North Korea can be deterred. We debate if Iraq was a just war. But we seldom step back and ask why the international order treats the same physical capability in others, and what that asymmetry costs the world. I came to this question not through the study of nuclear physics, but through the study of war. For years, I had been reading the diplomatic and military histories of the Middle East, South Asia, and the Korean Peninsula, and I kept encountering the same structural pattern. Sanctions, sabotage, isolation, military strikes, and bore no clear relationship to the severity of their actual transgression, but correlated powerfully with their geopolitical alignments. Iraq, which had no nuclear weapons program after 1991, was invaded. Israel, which has never submitted to international inspection, has never been serious enforcement. North Korea, which withdrew from the treaty and tested nuclear weapons, was sanctioned but ultimately tolerated. Libya, which voluntarily disarmed, was subsequently subjected to regime change. The pattern was not random. It was structured by something deeper than individual policy decisions. That something, I came to believe, was the architecture of the nuclear order itself. Specifically, the Treaty on the Non-proliferation of Nuclear Weapons and the enforcement system built around it. The NPT is one of the most successful arms control agreements in history. It has almost certainly prevented dozens of states from acquiring nuclear weapons. That achievement is real and should not be minimized, but the treaty also established a hierarchy: 5 recognized nuclear weapon states and everyone else. That was never intended to be permanent, but has become so in practice. The bargain at the heart of the treaty, non-proliferation by the many in exchange for disarmament by the few, has been enforced on one side and largely abandoned on the other. The consequences of that asymmetry are the subject of this book. I should be transparent about what I am arguing and what I am not. I am not arguing that nuclear proliferation is harmless. I am not arguing that all states are equally responsible custodians of nuclear weapons. I am not arguing that the NPT should be abandoned or that the IAEA has failed in its mission. I am arguing something more specific: that a system premised on permanent inequality between possessors and non-possessors, enforced selectively according to strategic alignment rather than universal principle, generates resentment, hedging, and crises that ultimately weaken the order it claims to protect. The double standard is not a rhetorical flourish. It is a
Flying over where I'm currently living, Northfield.
Structural feature of the regime, and it has consequences that can be traced through the historical record. This book attempts to trace those consequences across 11 major cases spanning 8 decades, from the first atomic detonation over Hiroshima to the collapse of the Iran nuclear deal and the accelerating nuclear arms race of the 2020s. Each case is treated as a test of the thesis, not a proof of a predetermined conclusion, but an honest examination of how the nuclear order's structure shaped the choices, perceptions, and fates of the states caught within it. A note on scope. This book is not a comprehensive history of nuclear weapons. Excellent histories exist, and I have drawn on them gratefully. Nor is it a technical primer on nuclear physics, weapons design, or verification methodology, though I have tried to explain these subjects accurately when they are relevant to the argument. It is, instead, an argument about power, law, and legitimacy, about who gets to possess the most destructive weapon ever created, who decides, and what happens to those who fall on the wrong side of that decision. If the argument succeeds, it should leave the reader not with certainty about what to do next, but with clarity about the real nature of the system we have and the costs of leaving it unreformed. I owe debts to many people who helped shape this project. Scholars of nuclear strategy, international law, arms control, and Middle Eastern, South Asian, and East Asian security studies will recognize where their work has informed mine, and I have tried to acknowledge those debts fully in the endnotes. Any errors of fact or interpretation are my own. 10. Author's note on method, evidence, and causation. A book that argues the nuclear order has contributed to wars and crises owes its readers an honest account of how it handles evidence and causation. This note explains the rules I have imposed on myself throughout the manuscript. On causation, the central claim of this book is that the unequal nuclear order has repeatedly structured which states were treated as legitimate possessors, which were treated as permanent suspects, which programs were tolerated, and which became targets for sanctions or preventive force. That is a claim about structural influence, not mechanical determinism. I do not argue that the NPT caused the 2003 invasion of Iraq in the way that a spark causes a fire. I argue that the regime's structure, its legal categories, its verification asymmetries, its enforcement patterns, created the conditions within which specific political decisions became possible, plausible, or even inevitable. Throughout the book, I distinguish carefully between 4 kinds of inequality, each with different causal weight. 1. Legal inequality. The treaty's own categories, nuclear weapon state versus non-nuclear weapon state, which impose different obligations, different levels of scrutiny, and different enforcement risks on different countries based on a historical cutoff rather than any ongoing assessment of responsibility. 2. Strategic inequality, the actual distribution of military capability, which does not map neatly onto the treaty's categories. India, Pakistan, and Israel possess nuclear weapons outside the treaty. North Korea withdrew and built them. Some NPT members have the technical capacity to build weapons quickly if they chose to. 3. Selective enforcement, the differential application of pressure, sanctions, and force to different states driven by the geopolitical interests of the enforcement powers rather than by the universal application of treaty norms. 4. War causation, the specific pathway from any of these forms of inequality to armed conflict. Not every chapter traces such a pathway. Some chapters examine how inequality shaped threat perceptions, strategic calculations, or institutional dynamics without producing a shooting war. Where a direct link to armed conflict is claimed, the evidence must be proportionately stronger. This framework means the book makes different kinds of claims in different chapters. The Iraq chapter makes the strongest causal claim, that the politics of nuclear suspicion, amplified by the regime's selective enforcement, was used to justify a war fought on false premises. The Ukraine chapter makes a different kind of claim, not that the NPT caused Russia's invasion, but that the failure of the Budapest Memorandum's security assurances damaged the credibility of the non-proliferation regime's promise that states can trade nuclear weapons for safety. The South Africa chapter makes still another kind of claim, that disarmament is possible, but only under conditions that reveal the limits of the model. On evidence, The evidentiary hierarchy for this book is as follows in descending order of reliability. 5. Primary legal texts, treaty language, UN Security Council resolutions, ICJ advisory opinions, and bilateral agreements. These are the authoritative statements of what the order promises and requires. 6. Institutional verification records, IAEA reports, inspection findings, and safeguards assessments. These are the closest the international system comes to objective, factual findings about nuclear activities. I treat them as highly reliable but not infallible. The book documents cases where safeguards failed to detect covert programs. 7. Post-war investigations and intelligence reviews, the Iraq Survey Group, Dual-Fer Report, the Butler Report, the Senate Intelligence Committee assessments, and similar official reviews conducted after the fact. These are especially important for the Iraq chapter, where the gap between pre-war claims and post-war findings is central to the argument. 8. Quantitative data, SIPRI Yearbook, data on warhead, inventories, force structures, and modernization programs, the Federation of American Scientists Nuclear Information Project, and similar open source. 13. Assessments. These provide the empirical backbone for claims about the current state of nuclear arsenals. 9. Diplomatic and political histories, memoirs, declassified cables, interview-based scholarship, and investigative journalism. We're currently heading to Burlington, Vermont, then to, I think Elizabethtown is our next flyover. They're essential for reconstructing decision-making processes but must be read critically, as participants have incentives to justify their own choices. Where sources conflict, I have tried to identify the conflict explicitly and explain my assessment of which account is more reliable and why. Where evidence is ambiguous, and in nuclear affairs, evidence is frequently ambiguous, I have tried to state the range of plausible interpretations rather than selecting the one most convenient for my thesis. Unfairness. A book about double standards has an obligation to avoid committing them. I have tried to apply the same analytical rigor to every state examined here, whether it is an ally or adversary of the Western enforcement powers, where states have legitimate security concerns that motivated their nuclear choices, and most of them do. I have tried to state those concerns fairly before assessing the consequences. Where the evidence for a state's nuclear transgressions is strong, I have not softened it to serve the thesis. Where the evidence is weak or contested, I have said so. The strongest counter-argument to this book's thesis is that the nuclear order, for all its imperfections, has been extraordinarily successful at limiting the number of nuclear. 14. Armed states. When President Kennedy warned in 1963 that the world might face 15 or 20 nuclear armed states within a decade, his fear was plausible. That it did not materialize is substantially due to the NPT and the institutions built around it. I take that argument seriously throughout the book, and I return to it directly in the concluding chapters. The question is not whether the order has done good, it manifestly has, but whether it can continue to function when its legitimacy is eroding from within. On terminology, I use nuclear order to refer to the full institutional, legal, and strategic system governing nuclear weapons, including the NPT, the IAEA, the UN Security Council's enforcement role, bilateral arms control agreements, nuclear weapon free zones, export control regimes, extended deterrence arrangements, and the emerging TPNW framework. I use nuclear regime and non-proliferation regime more narrowly to refer to the NPT-centered framework. I use nuclear weapon state and non-nuclear weapon state as defined by the NPT, and nuclear armed state to describe any state that possesses nuclear weapons regardless of NPT status. I follow the convention of capitalizing state only when quoting or closely paraphrasing treaty language. The global nuclear hierarchy. Former nuclear possessors. 4 states have possessed nuclear weapons and subsequently given them up. South Africa developed and dismantled an indigenous arsenal of 7 devices, 1979 to 1991. Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine inherited Soviet nuclear weapons after the dissolution of the USSR in 1991 and transferred them to Russia under international agreements. Nuclear weapon-free zones. 5 regional treaties establish nuclear weapon-free zones covering most of the southern hemisphere and large parts of Asia. Tlatelolco, Latin America and the Caribbean, 1967. Rarotonga, South Pacific, 1985. Bangkok, Southeast Asia, 1995. Pelindaba, Africa, 1996. And Semipalatinsk, Central Asia, 2006. Antarctica, the seabed, and outer space are also denuclearized by treaty. A Middle East nuclear weapon-free zone has been proposed for decades but never realized. The Challenger Regime. The Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, TPNW, which entered into force in January 2021, had 74 states, parties, and 95 signatories as of September 2025. All 9 nuclear-armed states and most of their allies have opposed the treaty. The first review conference is scheduled for late 2026. Introduction. The Monopoly and the Myth. On the morning of August 6, 1945, the crew of the Enola Gay released a single uranium bomb over the center of Hiroshima, Japan. The detonation, equivalent to roughly 15,000 tons of TNT, killed an estimated 70,000 people instantly, and tens of thousands more in the weeks and months that followed from burns and radiation sickness and blast injuries. 3 days later, a plutonium bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, killing approximately 40,000 people on the first day. By the end of 1945, the combined death toll had reached at least 200,000. These remain the only 2 uses of nuclear weapons in war. Every subsequent debate about nuclear arms, who may possess them, how many, under what constraints, and against whom they may be threatened, takes place in the shadow of what those 2 weapons did to 2 Japanese cities in the span of 72 hours. 80 years later, the world contains approximately 12,241 nuclear warheads distributed among 9 states. Roughly 3,900 of those weapons are deployed on missiles and aircraft, ready for use. Around 2,100 are kept on high operational alert, capable of being launched within minutes. The combined explosive yield of the global arsenal is sufficient to destroy human civilization several times over. This is the material reality that the International Nuclear Order exists to manage. But the order does not manage it equally. At its center is a structural contradiction so deeply embedded in international law and practice that it has become nearly invisible. The same 18. Weapon that is treated as the indispensable foundation of security for some states is treated as an intolerable threat to peace when other states pursue it. The United States, which maintains roughly 5,550 warheads and is in the midst of a modernization program that will eventually cost over $1 trillion, insists that Iran must not be permitted to enrich uranium to weapons-grade levels. Russia, which possesses approximately 5,580 warheads and expanded its nuclear doctrine in 2024 to lower the threshold for nuclear use, sits on the Security Council that imposes sanctions on North Korea for its much smaller arsenal. The United Kingdom and France each maintain submarine-based arsenals and support enforcement actions against other states' nuclear ambitions. China, which is building hundreds of new missile silos and expanding its arsenal faster than any other state, is a permanent member of the body that adjudicates other states' nuclear compliance. This is not hypocrisy in the colloquial sense of leaders saying one thing and doing another. It is a system, a legal, institutional, and strategic architecture designed in the 1960s and locked into place in 1995 that assigns fundamentally different rights and obligations to different states based on a single criterion: whether they tested a nuclear device before January 1st, 1967. That cutoff is not a principle. It is a date on a calendar. It happens to correspond to the moment when 5 particular states, the United States, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, France, and China, had demonstrated nuclear capability. every other state, regardless of its size, its security environment, its democratic credentials, or its record of international responsibility, is classified as a non-nuclear weapon state and is legally obligated to forego nuclear weapons permanently. The bargain that held the order together. The Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, opened for signature in 1968 and entering into force in 1970, is one of the most widely adhered to agreements in history, with 191 states parties. It encompasses nearly every sovereign state on Earth. Only 4 countries remain outside it: India, Pakistan, Israel, none of which ever signed, and North Korea, which withdrew in 2003. The NPT's near universality is itself an achievement, and the treaty has almost certainly prevented the world Kennedy feared, in which dozens of states might have acquired nuclear weapons. But the treaty's near universality was purchased with a bargain. The NPT rests on 3 interlocking promises. First, the non-nuclear weapon states agree not to acquire nuclear weapons and to accept international verification of their nuclear activities. Second, all states parties are guaranteed the inalienable right to develop nuclear energy for peaceful purposes without discrimination. Third, all parties, but especially the 5 recognized nuclear weapon states, commit to pursue negotiations in good faith toward nuclear disarmament. Article 6 of the treaty says so explicitly, and the International Court of Justice affirmed in 1996 that this constitutes a legal obligation, not merely a political aspiration. The first problem with increasing rigor. The IAEA's safeguard system, strengthened by the additional protocol after the post-1991 Iraqi revelations, monitors nuclear materials and activities in non-nuclear weapon states. The UN Security Council
there is no
And here we are in Syracuse, New York. We're just going to make a wide turnaround and then land. I hope everybody enjoyed the flight, and if you have any questions on the book or comments, please put them in the comment section. But I will be reading the rest of the book in upcoming videos. No, I didn't. Excuse my French. You might have to make a crash landing. That's good. That's good. The landing gear doesn't work very good in the FA-18 in this game for whatever reason. Thank you for joining me. Subscribe.